Across the world, ancient civilizations left behind ruins that still defy explanation. Massive stone towers, underground chambers carved into solid rock, sacred caves hidden beneath jungles and monuments aligned perfectly with the stars. But the questions still remain. How were these places built? Why were they abandoned? And what secrets are still buried beneath them? In this documentary, we explore forgotten ruins, lost civilizations, and mysterious ancient sites that continue to challenge archaeologists and historians today. Because the deeper we go into the ancient world, the stranger it becomes. So join us as we uncover the mysteries history still cannot fully explain. Meisho, the chamber that waits for the winter sun. Some ancient structures feel impressive because of their size. Others feel important because of what they survived. Meisho feels different for another reason. It feels calculated, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just carefully designed in a way that becomes more noticeable the longer you study it. Located on the Orkney Islands in northern Scotland, Meisho sits in a landscape already filled with prehistoric monuments, standing stones, burial mounds, ancient villages, evidence that this region was active long before written history reached it. But even among those sites, Meisho stands apart. At first glance, it looks simple, a grassy mound rising from otherwise flat land. Nothing about the exterior immediately reveals the complexity inside. In fact, if you didn't know what it was, you could easily mistake it for a natural hill. That's probably intentional. Because structures like this weren't built to dominate the landscape from a distance. They were built to hold something within them. And in Meisho's case, that something is not just a chamber, it's alignment. The structure dates back roughly 5,000 years, placing it in the Neolithic period. That alone is significant, because constructing something like this required organisation long before advanced tools or written planning systems existed. The mound itself is built from layers of earth and stone, but the important part lies at the centre. A narrow passage leads inward toward a chamber made of massive stone slabs. The walls are carefully arranged, fitted in a way that has allowed the interior to survive for thousands of years despite the harsh climate of the Orkney Islands. And this climate matters. Strong winds, constant moisture, cold winters. Building something durable here was not easy, which means durability had to be part of the design from the beginning. The entrance passage is long and low. You don't walk into Meisho casually. You move through it carefully, almost forced into awareness by the structure itself. That design changes the experience, it separates the outside world from the interior chamber in a very deliberate way, and that transition is important. Because Meisho was not just a shelter. It was built for a purpose that required controlled space. Most archaeologists classify it as a chambered tomb, and there's strong evidence supporting that interpretation. Human remains were likely placed here at some point, although very little survived due to later disturbances. But calling it just a tomb feels incomplete once you look at the engineering involved. Because Meisho does something unusual. Every year, around the winter solstice, the setting sun aligns with the entrance passage. For a brief period, sunlight enters the mound and travels directly into the central chamber. That alignment is not approximate, it's precise. And precision changes the conversation entirely, because aligning a structure with a specific solar event requires long-term observation. You need to track the movement of the sun across seasons. You need to understand where light enters, how angles change, and how the horizon interacts with the landscape. That's not accidental knowledge. That's accumulated observation. And this is where Meisho becomes more than architecture. It becomes evidence of planning connected to astronomy. Not astronomy in the modern scientific sense, but careful awareness of cycles in nature. The winter solstice mattered to many ancient societies because it marked a turning point. The shortest days of the year begin to reverse. Light slowly returns. In agricultural communities especially, that shift carried meaning. So when sunlight enters the chamber of Meisho during that exact period, it's difficult to see it as coincidence. The structure appears designed for that moment. What's interesting is that the alignment works through restraint, not excess. There's no decoration guiding your attention, no massive statues, no painted ceilings. The effect depends entirely on space, angle, and timing. That simplicity actually makes the achievement more impressive, because it means the builders relied on understanding rather than spectacle. The interior chamber itself is carefully constructed. Large stone slabs form the walls, and the corners are shaped with surprising precision. Smaller side chambers branch from the central room built directly into the thick stone structure. And here's something people often overlook. The chamber has remained dry for thousands of years. That's not luck. It means the builders understood drainage, structural pressure, and water management well enough to create an enclosed space capable of resisting the environment over an enormous span of time. Again, this points to planning, not primitive experimentation, not random stacking of stone, a method. There's also another layer to Mecho's history that complicates the site. Centuries after it was built, Vikings entered the chamber and left runic inscriptions on the walls. These carvings are among the largest collections of Norse runes found in one place, and that changes the atmosphere of the structure entirely, because now Mecho contains evidence of two completely different periods of human history interacting with the same space. The original builders created the chamber thousands of years earlier, then later visitors entered it, interpreted it in their own way, and left marks of their presence behind. That tells us something important about ancient structures. Their meanings evolve. A place built for one purpose can later become something else entirely. And Mecho survived long enough for that transformation to happen. Standing inside the chamber today, the feeling is difficult to describe accurately. Not because it feels supernatural, but because it feels controlled. The proportions, the silence, the way sound behaves inside the stone room, the awareness that light reaches this place only during a specific moment each year. Everything about it feels intentional, and maybe that's what makes Mecho so compelling, not mystery in the dramatic sense, but precision. The kind of precision that forces you to stop thinking about ancient people as disconnected from observation or engineering. Because sites like this prove the opposite. The builders understood their environment closely enough to shape stone, space, and sunlight into a single experience. And they did it well enough that the effect still works 5,000 years later. That's the part that stays with you. Not just that the structure survives. Stony Littleton, Long Barrow, the stone passage beneath the hill. Some prehistoric structures are designed to be seen from far away. Stony Littleton is not one of them. It doesn't rise dramatically from the landscape. It doesn't dominate the horizon or overwhelm you with size. In fact, if you didn't know what you were looking for, you might walk past it without realizing what it is. And yet, beneath this quiet mound in the countryside of Somerset, England, there is a structure that has remained intact for thousands of years. Not by accident, by design. Stony Littleton Long Barrow was built during the Neolithic period, roughly 5,000 years ago, at a time when communities across Britain were beginning to reshape the landscape in deliberate ways. This matters because these people were not simply surviving day to day. Structures like this required planning, labour coordination, and a shared understanding of purpose. A long barrow is essentially a burial monument, a mound built over stone chambers used for the dead. But that description alone doesn't fully explain sites like Stony Littleton. Because once you look beyond the mound itself, you realise the important part is hidden underneath. The entrance sits at one end of the mound, framed by upright stones. It's narrow and low, forcing anyone entering to move carefully. That physical restriction changes the experience immediately. You're not walking into an open structure. You're moving into a controlled space, one designed to separate the outside world from what lies within. The passage extends inward through the mound, leading to multiple burial chambers branching from the central corridor. And this layout is important, because it shows that the structure wasn't intended for a single burial event. It was reused, repeatedly, over time. That changes how we should think about the site. This wasn't simply a tomb sealed forever after one moment. It appears to have been a place people returned to, possibly across generations, and that suggests memory, tradition, continuity. The construction itself deserves attention. The chambers are built using large stone slabs carefully positioned to support the weight of the mound above. These stones were not randomly placed. The builders understood balance and pressure well enough to create internal spaces capable of surviving thousands of years underground. And this is where people often underestimate prehistoric engineering. Because when modern audiences hear Stone Age, they sometimes imagine crude methods and limited understanding. But structures like Stony Littleton challenge that assumption. The builders may not have had metal tools or written mathematics, but they clearly understood practical construction principles. Otherwise, this chamber wouldn't still exist. The mound above the chambers also plays a role beyond simple covering. It creates insulation, stability, protection from weather and erosion. In other words, the Earth itself becomes part of the architecture. That's an important detail because prehistoric builders frequently worked with the landscape instead of against it. They didn't separate structure from environment, they combined them. There's another interesting feature near the entrance. Above it sits a large capstone weighing several tons, positioned carefully over the opening. The effort required to move and place a stone like that would have been significant. Not impossible, but organised. And that organisation tells us something about the society that built it. Because projects like this don't happen casually. You need labour, planning, and a reason strong enough to justify the effort. The most accepted explanation is still burial ritual, and evidence supports that. Human remains were discovered within the chambers, confirming the site's use in funerary practices. But here's where interpretation becomes more complicated. The architecture seems designed not only for burial, but for interaction with the dead. The passage allows access. The side chambers separate remains into distinct spaces. This doesn't feel like a structure meant to be sealed permanently and forgotten. It feels maintained, visited, possibly revisited over generations. And that idea changes the emotional meaning of the site. Because now we're not just looking at disposal of bodies, we're looking at memory preserved through architecture. When you move through the passage today, one thing becomes immediately noticeable. Sound changes inside. The stone absorbs outside noise. The chambers feel enclosed in a way that isolates you from the landscape above. That effect probably mattered. Not because the builders were trying to create something mystical, but because enclosed spaces naturally shape human experience. The deeper you move inward, the more disconnected you feel from the outside world. And that separation reinforces the purpose of the structure itself. There's also the question of placement. Why build here? The surrounding landscape of Somerset is not random terrain. The barrow sits in elevated countryside with broad views across the area. Like many Neolithic monuments, visibility may have mattered. Not visibility of the chambers themselves, but visibility of the mound as a marker within the land. A sign that this place carried importance. Over time, the site changed. The original outer structure has weathered, and parts of the mound were altered through centuries of natural erosion and human activity. But the core remains, the passage still exists, the chambers still hold, the engineering still works, and that endurance is important, because it reminds us that prehistoric societies were capable of creating structures designed for permanence, not temporary shelters, not improvised burial pits, but architecture intended to outlast the people who built it. There's something else worth thinking about here. Structures like Stony Littleton were built long before written history in Britain. That means the beliefs, stories and intentions behind them were never fully recorded. We're left interpreting through material evidence alone, and that creates limits. We can study the stones, measure the chambers, analyse remains. But the emotional meaning, the reason this mattered deeply enough for people to build it, can only be partially recovered. Still, the structure tells us more than people often assume. It tells us these communities cared about continuity, about ritual, about creating spaces that connected generations through physical place. The Forgotten Stone Doors of Peru, Aramumuru. There are some archaeological sites where the mystery comes from what was built. At Aramumuru, the mystery begins with what wasn't. No chamber, no tunnel, no visible structure behind the stone. Just a doorway carved into solid rock, leading nowhere, and that's exactly why people keep returning to it. Aramumuru is located near Lake Titicaca in southern Peru, not far from the border with Bolivia. The region itself is already historically significant, connected to ancient Andean cultures that shaped large parts of pre-Columbian South America. The landscape there feels exposed, wide plains, wind moving constantly across the stone, mountains visible in the distance, and in the middle of that environment sits a large rock face with a perfectly defined rectangular carving cut directly into it. At first glance, it looks unfinished, like the entrance to a tomb or chamber that was abandoned before completion. But the closer you look, the stranger it becomes, because there's no excavation behind it, no interior space. The doorway exists only as a surface carving. The main structure measures several meters high, with a recessed central section carved into the stone. Inside that recessed area is a smaller doorway-like niche, just large enough for a person to stand within. And that detail matters. because the proportions appear intentional. This wasn't random shaping or quarry work. Someone wanted this specific form. The question is, why? One explanation is ceremonial use, and honestly, that's the most reasonable starting point. Ancient cultures across the Andes often treated stone formations as spiritually important. Certain locations were considered sacred not because of what stood there, but because of their relationship to landscape, mythology, or ritual practice. In that context, Aramumuru may have functioned as a symbolic gateway rather than a physical one, a place connected to ceremony, transition, or belief. That interpretation fits the design better than the idea of a practical entrance, because practically speaking, the structure doesn't go anywhere. But here's where the site becomes more complicated. The carving itself is unusually clean. The outer frame is sharply defined against the natural rock face, and the recessed surfaces are flattened in a way that clearly separates human modification from untouched stone. That doesn't mean impossible construction, but it does mean deliberate work, and deliberate work requires purpose. This is where a lot of modern storytelling around Aramumuru goes off track. You'll often hear claims about portals, hidden dimensions, or lost technology. But most of those ideas come from later myths and internet speculation, not archaeology. The real site is actually more interesting when you look at it realistically, because even without exaggerated claims, the design still raises valid questions. Why carve a doorway that doesn't open? Why shape solid rock into the form of an entrance without creating a chamber behind it? One possibility is symbolic architecture. We see versions of this in many ancient cultures, structures or carvings that imitate doors, windows, or passages without functioning literally. The symbolism matters more than physical access. A door can represent transition, connection, or movement between states, not necessarily movement between rooms. And that interpretation fits Aramumuru surprisingly well, especially given its isolated location and lack of defensive or residential features. There's another detail people often overlook. The site is acoustically unusual. The rock surface reflects sound sharply, and the open landscape around it creates a strange sense of isolation when standing directly inside the carved niche. Now, that doesn't prove anything mystical. But it does matter psychologically. Ancient ritual spaces often relied on sensory experience, light, sound, enclosure, elevation, to shape how people felt within them. Aramumuru may have worked the same way, not through hidden mechanisms or supernatural effects, but through atmosphere created intentionally by location and design. The site is also unfinished in one important sense. The surrounding rock face shows signs that additional carving may have been planned or partially started. Some archaeologists believe the structure could have been abandoned before completion, possibly due to changes in political or cultural conditions. And honestly, that explanation makes sense, because ancient projects were not immune to interruption. Communities changed, leadership shifted, ritual systems evolved. A sacred site could lose importance before reaching its final form. But even if Aramumuru was unfinished, the central carving clearly mattered enough to complete carefully. The proportions are balanced, the geometry is controlled, and the niche at the centre feels intentionally human in scale, not monumental, personal, almost interactive. Standing in front of it today, the experience feels strange, not because it looks impossible, but because it triggers expectation. Your brain sees a doorway and assumes depth behind it, an interior, a hidden chamber, but there's nothing there, and that disconnect creates tension. The structure looks functional while refusing to function in the way we expect. That's probably why the site became surrounded by stories over time. Humans naturally try to explain spaces that feel incomplete, especially when the original meaning has been lost, and in the absence of records, imagination fills the gap. Still, the archaeological reality remains enough on its own. A large ceremonial-style doorway carved directly into stone. No clear practical purpose, no definitive explanation, and no surviving written account describing why it was made. But uncertainty doesn't automatically equal mystery. Sometimes it simply means context disappeared. The people who understood this place completely are gone. What remains is the physical evidence, and our attempt to interpret it carefully. And that's what makes Aramumuru worth studying. Not because it proves something supernatural, but because it reveals how strongly ancient people could shape meaning into landscape itself. A cliff face became architecture. A symbolic opening became a destination. and a doorway with nothing behind it continued to hold significance long after its creators disappeared. The desert tombs. No civilization claims Pantalica Necropolis, Sicily. Some ancient sites leave behind monuments, others leave behind cities. Pantalica leaves behind absence. Thousands of tombs carved into rock, but almost no clear explanation of the people who made them. And that's what makes the site feel unusual, not because it's hidden, but because so much physical evidence survived while the identity of its builders slowly faded out of history. Pantalica is located in southeastern Sicily, spread across steep limestone cliffs overlooking deep river valleys. The landscape itself is dramatic. Dry rock formations broken by vegetation, narrow canyons, and elevated plateaus that naturally separate sections of the terrain. It's the kind of place that already feels ancient before you even see the tombs. And then the cliff walls begin to change. Small openings appear everywhere, hundreds at first, then thousands. The necropolis of Pantalica contains an estimated 5,000 rock-cut tombs carved directly into the limestone cliffs. That number alone changes the scale of the conversation, because this was not a small burial site used by a limited community. This was long-term activity across generations, possibly centuries, and constructing tombs in this environment required far more effort than simply burying people in the ground. Each tomb is relatively small, usually consisting of a carved chamber cut horizontally into the rock face. Most are simple in structure. No elaborate carvings, no massive entrances, no decorated interiors like later Egyptian tombs. At first glance, they almost seem repetitive, but repetition itself tells us something important. It suggests system, a shared method followed consistently over time. The civilization most commonly associated with Pantalica is the Sicyl culture, an ancient population that existed in Sicily before Greek colonization. But here's where things become less certain. Compared to other Mediterranean civilizations, the Sicels left behind relatively few written records. Most of what we know comes indirectly, from archaeology, later Greek accounts, and the physical remains themselves. That creates a strange imbalance at Pantalica. We have thousands of tombs, but very little direct explanation from the people who built them, and that gap changes how the site feels, because normally large burial complexes are tied clearly to kings, dynasties, religions, or documented rituals. At Pantalica, the structures remain, but much of the cultural identity around them is fragmented. The location of the tombs also deserves attention. They are not randomly scattered across accessible ground. Many are carved high into cliff faces, requiring effort to reach even today. That immediately raises a practical question. Why place tombs in difficult locations? One explanation is defense. Elevated burial areas are harder to disturb, both by animals and by people. Another possibility is symbolic separation, placing the dead physically above or apart from the spaces used by the living. And honestly, both explanations may be true at the same time. Ancient societies often combined practical and symbolic thinking in architecture. But there's another detail that becomes obvious once you study the layout. The tombs were added gradually. This wasn't one massive construction event. The necropolis expanded over time, with new chambers carved into the cliffs generation after generation. And that continuity tells us something important. This place mattered consistently. Communities kept returning here, which means the landscape itself likely held cultural significance beyond simple burial. Archaeologists believe Pantalica reached its peak during the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, a period of instability across parts of the Mediterranean. And that context matters, because difficult terrain like this offers natural protection. The valleys surrounding the site are steep and difficult to cross, making the region easier to defend than open settlements. In other words, people may not have chosen this location only for ritual reasons. Survival may have played a role too. That combination, defensive geography and large burial zones, suggests a society deeply connected to the landscape around it, not dominating it through monumental architecture, but adapting to it strategically. When you walk through Pantalica today, the scale becomes difficult to process. The tombs stretch across entire cliff sections, some clustered tightly together, others isolated. And because many are small and uniform, the effect feels less like individual memorials and more like collective presence. Almost like the cliffs themselves were transformed into archives of memory. There's something else worth noticing. Unlike many famous ancient tombs, Pantalica does not center around elites. There are no obvious pyramids, giant mausoleums, or singular royal chambers dominating the site. That's significant, because it suggests a burial tradition distributed across the community rather than concentrated around rulers alone, and that changes how we think about the society itself. The simplicity of the tombs also matters. Modern audiences sometimes associate sophistication with decoration, but simplicity can reflect efficiency and consistency rather than lack of skill. At Pantalica, the builders focused on carving functional chambers into difficult terrain repeatedly and reliably. That required knowledge of stone, structural stability, and labour organisation, especially at this scale. Over time, later civilizations arrived in Sicily: Greeks, Romans, others, and gradually, the people who originally built Pantalica became harder to define clearly in historical memory. The tombs remained visible, but the identity connected to them blurred. And maybe that's why the site feels different from other archaeological locations. It doesn't belong strongly to a famous empire. It exists slightly outside the better-known historical narrative of the Mediterranean. Not forgotten entirely, but disconnected from the level of recognition given to larger civilizations nearby. Still, the physical evidence remains undeniable. Thousands of chambers, carved by hand, spread across cliffs and valleys over generations. That level of effort only happens when a place carries meaning strong enough to outlast individuals. The buried temple found under the jungle floor, Tacalicabaj, Guatemala. One of the biggest misconceptions people have about ancient ruins is the idea that they were lost in a dramatic way. Most of the time, they weren't hidden suddenly. They were abandoned slowly, and then nature continued where people stopped. Tacalicabaj is a perfect example of that, because what makes this site remarkable isn't just what was built there, it's how completely the jungle absorbed it over time. Tacalicabaj is located in southern Guatemala near the Pacific foothills, in a region where dense vegetation and heavy rainfall shape the landscape constantly. That environment matters immediately, because tropical climates are difficult places to preserve architecture. Stone survives, but roads disappear, wood decays, structures collapse under roots, moisture, and shifting ground. In a jungle environment, abandonment doesn't leave ruins exposed for long, it buries them, and for centuries that's exactly what happened here. The site gradually disappeared beneath layers of vegetation and soil until archaeologists began uncovering what remained underneath. But what they found was more important than a single buried structure. They found evidence of transition. Tacalicabaj is archaeologically significant because it appears to sit between two major Mesoamerican worlds, the earlier Olmec tradition and the later Maya civilization. And that makes the site unusually valuable, because transitional periods are where you can actually watch cultures changing instead of appearing suddenly in history. At first glance, the ruins themselves don't seem as visually overwhelming as places like Tikal or Palenque. There are no towering jungle pyramids dominating the skyline, but once you understand the timeline, the site becomes much more interesting. Because Tacalicabaj developed gradually over centuries, not as one giant construction project, but as an evolving ceremonial and political centre. The site contains platforms, sculpted monuments, drainage systems, plazas and temple foundations spread across the landscape, and the layout tells us something important immediately. This was organised space, not random settlement growth. The structures align around ceremonial areas and elevated platforms in ways that suggest planning from early stages of occupation. One of the most important details at Tacalicabaj is the presence of massive carved stone monuments. Some clearly reflect Olmec artistic influence. Large sculptural forms, rounded facial features, and symbolic imagery associated with earlier Mesoamerican traditions. But later sections of the site begin to show more recognizable Maya characteristics. And that overlap is rare, because it allows archaeologists to study cultural transition directly in the material evidence. This is where the site becomes more than just another ruin. It becomes evidence that civilizations don't appear fully formed overnight. The Maya didn't emerge in isolation. They developed through interaction, adaptation, and inherited systems from earlier cultures around them. Tacalicabaj preserves part of that process. The buried temple structures at the site also reveal something important about construction practices in Mesoamerica. Like many ancient societies in the region, the builders often constructed new layers over older sacred spaces. Instead of destroying previous structures completely, they expanded on top of them. That means excavation at Takalika doesn't just uncover one phase of history, it uncovers stacked phases, different generations building over earlier foundations while still preserving the significance of the location itself. And this layered construction changes how archaeologists study the site, because every deeper level potentially represents an earlier cultural phase, a different architectural style, a different political period, a different understanding of the space. There's also strong evidence that Takalika functioned as a trade centre. Its location connected highland and coastal regions, allowing movement of goods like obsidian, cacao, ceramics, and jade. That matters because trade routes often accelerate cultural exchange. Ideas move with materials, and sites positioned along those routes tend to absorb influences from multiple regions. That may explain why Takalika shows both Olmec and Maya characteristics. It wasn't isolated, it was connected. The engineering at the site deserves attention too. Archaeologists uncovered carefully designed drainage systems built to manage heavy tropical rainfall, and in a jungle environment, that's critical. Without drainage, structures deteriorate quickly. Water undermines foundations, so the presence of planned water management tells us the builders understood the environment they were dealing with. Again, this is not primitive improvisation, it's adaptation through experience. One thing people often underestimate about jungle ruins is how much labour was required simply to maintain them. In environments like this, nature pushes back constantly. Vegetation regrows, roots break apart stone, moisture damages surfaces. Maintaining a ceremonial centre in the jungle required continuous effort, and that means Takalika was not briefly occupied. It was actively sustained over long periods. When the site eventually declined, the jungle reclaimed it surprisingly fast. That's part of why so much of it remained hidden for centuries, not because people forgot where it was immediately, but because tropical landscapes erase human absence quickly. Without maintenance, paths vanish. Structures collapse inward, the forest closes, and there's something important about that process. It reminds us that permanence in archaeology is relative. Even major ceremonial centres can disappear from visibility if the environment is strong enough. Standing at Takalika today, you don't just see ruins, you see layers of occupation, adaptation, and transition preserved beneath vegetation and earth. The site doesn't represent a single civilization frozen in time. It represents movement between worlds, between older traditions and emerging systems, between cultures influencing each other across generations. And maybe that's what makes it so important historically. Not because it's the largest or most visually dramatic ruin in Mesoamerica, but because it captures something historians rarely get to observe clearly: change itself. A ceremonial centre shaped over centuries, partially buried beneath the jungle floor, holding traces of civilizations meeting, evolving and rebuilding over time. The cave city that suddenly vanished, Taos Cave, Ecuador. Some places become famous because of what was found there. Taos Cave became famous because people couldn't agree on what they were looking at: a natural cave system, a ceremonial site, an undiscovered city, at one point, even a supposed underground library, and that confusion tells you something important immediately. The real story of Taos Cave became buried underneath decades of speculation. Located in the eastern region of Ecuador, near the border of the Amazon basin, Taos Cave sits within a landscape that already feels difficult to fully map. Dense jungle, steep terrain, heavy rainfall, limited visibility. Even reaching the entrance requires effort, and environments like this naturally create uncertainty, because exploration itself becomes difficult. That's important to remember before discussing any of the larger claims connected to the site, because isolated places tend to attract mythology very quickly. The cave system is named after the oil birds, known locally as tayos, that inhabit parts of the underground chambers. But what made the site internationally famous wasn't the birds. It was the idea that something artificial might exist deep inside the cave network. The modern mystery surrounding Taos Cave exploded in the 20th century after reports described enormous underground chambers, unusually straight passages, and smooth surfaces that some visitors interpreted as evidence of artificial construction. Books and documentaries amplified those claims further. Soon, the cave wasn't just a geological site anymore. It became connected to stories about lost civilizations, hidden metallic libraries, and unknown ancient knowledge. At one point, the rumours became so widespread that a major expedition involving scientists, explorers, and even astronaut Neil Armstrong travelled to the site in the 1970s to investigate it directly. And that's where things start separating into two very different stories, the mythology and the archaeology. Because scientifically speaking, Taos Cave is real, impressive, and geologically significant without needing any exaggerated claims attached to it. The cave system contains massive chambers, vertical shafts, underground rivers, and naturally formed passages extending deep beneath the landscape. And when you're inside spaces like that, scale changes perception. Natural formations begin to feel unnatural, simply because human brains struggle to process environments that large underground. That psychological effect matters more than people realise. Straight lines look intentional, smooth walls feel engineered, large chambers feel designed, especially under limited light, where perspective becomes difficult to judge accurately. And this is where many of the more extreme interpretations likely began. Now, to be fair, there are features within Taos Cave that genuinely stand out. Certain passages appear unusually angular compared to what people expect from natural cave erosion. Some surfaces are surprisingly flat, and there are areas where debris patterns create the illusion of constructed flooring. But geological processes can produce shapes that appear artificial without human involvement. That distinction is critical, because unusual does not automatically mean man-made. The famous metal library story is a perfect example of how speculation can overtake evidence. According to later claims, hidden chambers inside the cave supposedly contained metallic tablets engraved with unknown information from a lost civilization. The problem is simple. No verified evidence of such a library has ever been produced scientifically. No authenticated artifacts, no confirmed chamber matching the descriptions, and even members of the major expeditions later clarified that many of the sensational claims were exaggerated or unsupported. But here's the interesting part. Even after removing the myths, the cave still remains fascinating. Because the real question isn't, did someone build an underground city? The real question is, why did people immediately want to believe that they did? Part of the answer comes from how the cave feels. Taos Cave is not visually comforting. The descent is steep, the darkness is complete. Sound behaves strangely underground. Echoes shift unpredictably, water amplifies in certain chambers, and distance becomes difficult to judge. Once you're deep enough inside, orientation starts breaking down, and in environments like that, interpretation becomes unstable. People start projecting meaning onto what they see. There's also evidence that indigenous groups in the region knew about and used parts of the cave system, long before international explorers arrived. For local communities, caves often held ceremonial or spiritual significance. That's common across many cultures. Underground spaces naturally become associated with transition, origins, or contact with forces beyond ordinary life. So ritual use is entirely possible in sections of the cave, but ritual use is very different from evidence of a hidden civilization, and this is where Taos Cave becomes a good lesson in archaeology itself. Because archaeology is not just about discovering things, it's about separating observation from assumption. At Taos, we can confirm the geology, we can confirm human exploration, we can confirm cultural significance within the region. What we cannot confirm are the larger legendary claims attached later. And understanding that difference matters, because sometimes the real story becomes harder to hear once mythology grows around it. Still, the cave remains extraordinary on its own terms. The scale alone is enough to understand why early explorers reacted so strongly to it. Massive underground chambers hidden beneath dense jungle create a natural sense of discovery. Even without lost libraries or vanished civilizations, environments like this trigger imagination automatically. And maybe that's why the myths survived so long. Not because the evidence proved them, but because the setting made them feel possible. Standing near the entrance today, it's easy to underestimate what lies below. From the surface, the jungle looks continuous, stable. But underneath it exists an entirely different landscape. Dark, vertical, and difficult to fully understand even now. That contrast changes how the site feels. Because Taos Cave is really two places at once, the visible world above ground and the hidden world beneath it. The ancient ruins discovered beneath a lake, Pavlopetri, Greece. Most ancient cities are uncovered slowly, stone by stone, wall by wall. Pavlopetri was different. It wasn't buried under earth or hidden beneath jungle. It was sitting underwater the entire time, and for centuries people passed above it without realizing an entire Bronze Age settlement existed below the surface. Pavlopetri is located off the southern coast of Greece near Laconia, in shallow water between the mainland and a small island. Today, the sea there looks calm and almost empty, but beneath that surface lies one of the oldest known submerged cities in the world, and what makes it remarkable is not just its age, it's how complete the layout still is. When archaeologists first began studying the site seriously in the 20th century, they realised they weren't looking at scattered ruins. They were looking at an organised settlement, streets, buildings, courtyards, burial areas, a planned urban space now resting beneath several metres of water, and that immediately changed the importance of the site, because underwater archaeology often deals with fragments, shipwrecks, collapsed structures, isolated artefacts. Pavlopetri preserves an actual city layout. That's extremely rare. The settlement is believed to date back more than 3,000 years, with some evidence suggesting even earlier occupation phases. That places it firmly within the Bronze Age Mediterranean world, during a period when maritime trade connected civilizations across the Aegean region. And this context matters, because Pavlopetri was not isolated. Its location suggests it likely functioned as a coastal trading settlement, connected to larger networks moving goods, materials, and ideas between communities. The streets at the site are still visible underwater, not perfectly preserved, of course, but clear enough to reveal intentional planning. Buildings are arranged in recognizable patterns. Rooms connect logically. Pathways separate spaces. This wasn't random construction growing without order. It was designed. And this is where Pavlopetri becomes especially valuable to archaeologists, because many ancient cities were rebuilt repeatedly over centuries. Later civilizations altered earlier layouts, destroying evidence of original planning. But Pavlopetri sank relatively early in its history. In a strange way, the flooding preserved a snapshot of the settlement before later redevelopment could erase it. Now naturally, the first big question is obvious. How did the city end up underwater? The answer appears to involve a combination of geological instability and rising sea levels over long periods of time. Southern Greece sits in a tectonically active region where earthquakes can reshape coastlines significantly. A major seismic event may have contributed to subsidence, where land gradually sinks relative to sea level. Combined with long-term environmental changes, the settlement slowly became submerged. And that distinction matters, because Pavlopetri probably didn't disappear overnight in a dramatic catastrophe. More likely, the process happened gradually enough for people to leave. That's important because popular culture often wants lost cities to vanish suddenly. But archaeology usually points towards slower transitions. Environmental pressure, changing coastlines, economic shifts, communities relocating over time. Still, the underwater setting changes how the ruins feel emotionally. Because cities are not supposed to exist beneath open water. Your brain sees streets and walls, but the environment around them is completely wrong. Fish move through spaces where people once walked. Light shifts across stone foundations shaped for dry land. And that contrast creates a strange sense of disconnection. The preservation at Pavlopetri also reveals details that would normally disappear. Researchers identified structures that appear to include multi-room buildings, courtyards, and storage areas. There's even evidence suggesting organised drainage systems and urban planning concepts. That's significant, because it shows Bronze Age communities in this region were not improvising settlements randomly along the coast. They were designing functional urban spaces with infrastructure in mind. And this is where underwater archaeology becomes incredibly useful. Sites like Pavlopetri preserve information that land-based cities often lose through later occupation. No medieval town was built on top of this. No modern city replaced it. Once submerged, the settlement effectively froze in time. Damaged by the sea, yes, but also protected from centuries of rebuilding. There's another important point here. Pavlopetri challenges the way people imagine ancient societies. A lot of modern audiences still unconsciously think of Bronze Age communities as relatively simple. But urban planning tells a different story. You don't create organised streets, storage systems, and coordinated architecture without administration, labour organisation, and long-term stability. That requires structure within the society itself. The site also reinforces how dependent ancient civilizations were on geography. Coastal settlements offered advantages: trade access, fishing, transportation routes, but they also carried risks. A changing shoreline could transform an entire city's future over generations, and Pavlopetri became evidence of that vulnerability. When divers move through the site today, the experience is strangely calm. There are no towering ruins, no dramatic columns rising from the seafloor. Most of the structures remain low to the ground, subtle, almost quiet beneath the water. But that subtlety makes the site feel more real, because it doesn't look mythological, it looks lived in. You can recognize spaces shaped for ordinary activity, movement, storage, shelter, daily life. And somehow that's more powerful than monumental ruins, because it reminds you this wasn't just architecture, it was a functioning community. People planned streets here, stored goods here, walked between buildings here, and then over time, the sea slowly replaced all of it. There's something deeply human about that process. Not destruction through war, not collapse through invasion, just gradual environmental change reshaping the landscape until the city no longer belonged to the world above water. And that's what makes Pavlopetri so important historically. It isn't just an underwater ruin, it's evidence of how fragile permanence really is. Even organised cities connected to major trade networks can disappear quietly if geography changes enough. The mountain carvings nobody can explain. Filitosa menhirs, Corsica. Some ancient monuments are impressive because of their scale, others because of their precision. The stone figures at Filitosa stand out for a different reason. They feel personal, not abstract shapes placed into the landscape, but human forms carved into stone thousands of years ago. Silent faces still staring outward long after the people who shaped them disappeared. And even now, archaeologists still debate exactly what they were meant to represent. Filitosa is located on the island of Corsica in the Mediterranean, surrounded by rocky hills, olive trees, and uneven terrain shaped by wind and dry climate over long periods of time. At first glance, the site doesn't look dramatic. There are no massive temples, no giant pyramids, just scattered stone structures and standing figures rising quietly from the landscape. But the longer you study the site, the more unusual it becomes. Because the carvings here are among the earliest known monumental stone figures in the Mediterranean region, and they don't fully resemble anything else around them. The most famous features at Filitosa are the menhirs, upright standing stones carved with human-like details. Some display faces, others show weapons, belts, armour, or abstract body shapes worked directly into the surface, and that immediately separates them from ordinary standing stones. These weren't just markers, they were representations. The question is, representations of what? Archaeologists believe the site developed during the late Neolithic and Bronze Age periods, with activity stretching across different phases over centuries. That timeline matters because Filitosa was not built all at once. Like many prehistoric sites, it evolved gradually. Structures were added, modified, reused, and sometimes intentionally broken or buried. The carvings themselves vary in complexity. Some menhirs are simple, with only faint facial outlines. Others are more detailed, clearly showing stylized features and carved weapons. That variation suggests different purposes, or at least different moments in the site's history. Because once artistic traditions begin changing, it usually means societies themselves are changing too. And this is where Filitosa becomes especially interesting. The carved weapons visible on some stones appear connected to conflict. Daggers, sword-like shapes, protective gear. That implies these figures may have represented warriors or important individuals within the community, not gods in an abstract sense, but people, or at least symbolic versions of people. But here's where interpretation becomes difficult. We don't have written records explaining the carvings, no inscriptions, no surviving myths directly tied to the site. Everything archaeologists conclude comes from the physical evidence alone, and physical evidence has limits. Still, the site reveals patterns worth paying attention to. Some of the menhirs were later reused in defensive structures built around the settlement. That detail is extremely important, because it means later populations interacted with older monuments already standing there. And when societies reuse ancient stones, it usually means one of two things. Either the original meaning was forgotten, or the old symbols still carried power worth controlling. At Filitosa, it may have been a mixture of both. The older carved stones remained visible enough to matter, even as the society around them changed. There's also evidence of destruction. Some menhirs appear deliberately damaged or buried during later construction phases, and archaeologists have debated this for years. Were older symbols intentionally erased by new groups arriving in the region? Was this cultural replacement, political conflict, or simply practical reuse of available stone? We don't fully know, but the damage itself tells us something changed. And this is one of the most interesting parts of archaeology that people rarely talk about. Ancient societies were not static. They argued, fought, replaced each other's symbols, changed traditions over time. Sites like Filitosa preserve those transitions physically in stone. The location itself also matters. Corsica sits in the middle of Mediterranean movement routes. Even in prehistoric periods, the island was not completely isolated. Trade and migration likely brought outside influence into the region. And that may explain why the carvings feel both familiar and unusual at the same time. They reflect a local identity, but possibly shaped through wider Mediterranean interaction. When you walk through Filitosa today, the atmosphere feels strangely balanced between natural and artificial. The stones don't dominate the environment aggressively, they emerge from it, some partially weathered, others leaning slightly after thousands of years exposed to the elements. But the carved faces remain visible, and that's the part people react to immediately. Because humans instinctively respond to faces, even simplified ones. Looking at those stone figures creates an uncomfortable sense of connection across time, not because the carvings are hyper-realistic, they aren't, but because someone deliberately shaped human identity into permanent material, and that decision carries meaning. The technology itself wasn't advanced in a modern sense. The carvings are rough compared to later sculpture traditions, but skill isn't only about precision, it's about intention. And at Filitosa, the intention is obvious. These stones were meant to be seen, recognized, remembered. Over time, erosion softened many details. Some carvings became difficult to interpret completely, but enough remains to confirm the core idea. This was symbolic stonework tied directly to human identity and social meaning, not random decoration, and maybe that's why the site continues to attract attention today. Because even without full explanation, the carvings still communicate something emotionally understandable. Presence, memory, authority, conflict. The people who made these stones likely understood exactly what each figure represented. To them, the meaning may have been obvious, but historical memory doesn't survive equally. The stones remained longer than the explanations behind them, and that leaves modern archaeology in a difficult position. We can analyze style, date materials, study placement, but interpretation remains incomplete because the cultural voice behind the carvings disappeared long ago. Still, the site speaks clearly in another way. The megalithic site buried beneath sandstorms, Choga Zanbil, Iran. Some ancient structures were built to impress people standing nearby. Choga Zanbil was built to dominate the horizon itself. Even now, after thousands of years of erosion, collapse, war and desert winds, the massive stepped structure still rises from the plains of southwestern Iran like something unfinished by time, and in many ways, it is unfinished. That's one of the first things archaeologists noticed about the site. Choha Zanbil is located in the Khuzestan region of Iran, not far from the ancient city of Susa. The site was founded around 1250 BCE by the Elamite king Untashnapirisha as a religious centre dedicated to important Elamite gods, especially in Shushanak. That context matters immediately, because unlike many ancient cities that developed gradually over centuries, Choha Zanbil appears to have been planned deliberately from the beginning. This was not a village that slowly expanded, it was a ceremonial project, a sacred city built around a central monumental structure, a ziggurat. Now, the word ziggurat is important here. People often compare ziggurats to pyramids because of the stepped shape, but their purpose was different. Egyptian pyramids were primarily tombs. Ziggurats functioned more like elevated temple platforms connected to religious ritual and divine symbolism. They were designed to raise sacred space above ordinary ground. And Choga Zanbil became one of the largest and best preserved examples ever discovered outside Mesopotamia. At its height, the ziggurat likely stood over 50 meters tall, built in multiple terraces rising upward from a square base. Today much of the upper structure is gone, but enough remains to understand the original scale. And scale is the first thing that changes your perception when standing there. Because the structure was not built from small decorative stone blocks. It was built primarily from mud brick and baked brick on a massive scale. That detail matters more than people realise. Mud brick architecture is vulnerable. Rain, wind, temperature shifts. Over centuries, these materials usually collapse heavily unless maintained continuously. So the fact that Chogar Zanbil still survives at all tells us the builders understood structural reinforcement remarkably well. There's another detail archaeologists found especially interesting. The city surrounding the ziggurat was protected by 3 concentric enclosure walls. Not 1, 3. That immediately suggests layered planning. The outer areas contained residences and royal sections. Inner zones became increasingly restricted and sacred. And at the centre stood the ziggurat itself. That kind of spatial organisation reflects social hierarchy physically built into architecture. The deeper inward you moved, the more symbolically important the space became. And this is where Chogar Zanbil starts feeling different from many Bronze Age sites. Because the city was not organised primarily around trade or defence, it was organised around ritual. The architecture itself directs attention toward the sacred centre. Everything leads inward, upward, toward elevation. But there's also something unusual about the site historically. It was never fully completed. Archaeologists discovered unused bricks, and evidence suggesting construction stopped before the original vision could be finished, and that changes the emotional feeling of the place completely. Because Chogar Zanbil is both monumental and interrupted at the same time. Why construction stopped is still debated. One major factor was likely political instability after the death of Untashnapirsha himself. Large ceremonial projects in ancient kingdoms often depended heavily on royal support. Once leadership changed, priorities changed too, and unfinished sacred cities became difficult to sustain. Then came another major event. Around the 7th century BCE, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal attacked and destroyed major Elamite centres, including the region around Chogar Zanbil. After that, the city gradually declined, and the desert began taking it back. This is where the environment becomes part of the story. Khuzestan is harsh terrain, heat, dust, wind. Sand carried across open plains over centuries. Unlike jungle environments that bury ruins through vegetation, desert regions erase structures differently. They wear them down slowly, layer by layer. Edges soften, brick crumbles. Details disappear into the same earth the buildings were made from. And because Chogar Zanbil was built largely from mud brick, the environment constantly threatened the site, which makes its survival even more remarkable. The excavations themselves revealed something important too. The Elamites were not simply copying Mesopotamian architecture. They adapted the ziggurat tradition into something culturally distinct. Inscriptions, temple layouts, and religious design elements all reflect specifically Elamite identity. That matters historically because the Elamites are often overshadowed by neighbouring civilizations like Mesopotamia, Babylon, or Persia. But Chogar Zanbil proves they were capable of monumental architecture and complex urban planning on a major scale. There's also evidence of sophisticated water management systems around the site, and in a dry environment, water infrastructure becomes critical. Ancient builders here developed reservoirs and systems to support the city despite difficult conditions. Again, this reflects planning beyond simple monument construction. This was intended to function as a living ceremonial centre, not just a symbolic structure in isolation. When modern visitors arrive at Chogar Zanbil today, one thing becomes immediately obvious: the isolation. The surrounding plains feel enormous and empty, and then suddenly the stepped mass of the ziggurat rises from the landscape almost unnaturally, not hidden, not subtle, but separated from everything around it. That separation probably mattered in antiquity too, because sacred architecture often relies on contrast. The ordinary world below, the elevated sacred space above, and the physical climb upward reinforcing spiritual hierarchy. Even now, the surviving terraces still create that effect. The structure pulls your attention vertically, not through decoration, but through mass and geometry. And maybe that's why Chogar Zanbil continues feeling powerful despite its damaged condition. Because the core idea still survives: a city built around sacred elevation, a monument designed to connect political authority, religious identity, and architectural permanence into one enormous structure rising from the desert plain. The mysterious towers scattered across Sardinia, Nurag, Sardinia. Some ancient civilizations leave behind writing, Others leave behind monuments. The people of Bronze Age Sardinia left behind towers, thousands of them, stone structures rising from hills, valleys, plains, and coastlines across the island, so numerous that even today archaeologists still debate exactly how many once existed. And what makes them unusual isn't just their number, it's the fact that no other civilization built structures quite like them. Across the island of Sardinia, more than 7,000 nuraghi have been identified, though the original number may have been far higher before erosion and collapse over time. These towers were built by the Nuragic civilization, which developed on the island during the Bronze Age, beginning around 1800 BCE. That timeline matters immediately, because the Nuragic people were not a minor isolated tribe improvising basic settlements. The scale of construction across Sardinia suggests a highly organised society capable of coordinated labour, long-term planning, and widespread architectural consistency. And yet, compared to civilizations like Egypt or Mesopotamia, they left behind very little written evidence explaining themselves. So the towers became the primary historical voice of the culture. At first glance, a nuraghi looks deceptively simple. A massive circular stone tower, thick walls, narrow entrances, sometimes standing alone, sometimes surrounded by additional walls, smaller towers, or entire village complexes. But once you study the construction closely, the sophistication becomes obvious. Most nuraghi were built using large stone blocks stacked without mortar. That detail is important, because dry stone construction at this scale depends entirely on balance, weight distribution, and careful placement. The stones hold together not because they are glued or cemented, but because the structure was engineered correctly. And some of these towers have survived for over 3,000 years. That alone tells you the builders understood structural stability extremely well. Inside many nuraghi, the walls narrow gradually upward, forming what's known as a corbelled dome. Each layer of stone projects slightly inward, until the opening closes near the top. This method allows large enclosed chambers without needing true arches or advanced support systems. Again, this is not accidental engineering. It's practical architectural knowledge refined through experience. And this raises the first major question: why build so many towers? That's where interpretation becomes complicated, because archaeologists still debate the exact function of nuraghi. Some clearly had defensive uses. The elevated positions, narrow entrances, and thick walls support that idea strongly. Others may have functioned as status symbols, ceremonial centres, or community gathering places, and honestly, the answer may not be singular. Different towers likely serve different purposes depending on location and period. But there's another detail people often overlook. The distribution of nuraghi across Sardinia is incredibly dense. In some areas, towers stand within visible distance of one another. That suggests communication, control over territory, or at minimum, a highly connected cultural network spread across the island. This matters because societies capable of constructing thousands of large stone towers are not socially simple. They require labour organisation, resource management, and shared architectural tradition over long periods of time, and Sardinia maintained that tradition for centuries. Some of the larger complexes became extremely sophisticated. Sunuraxi, one of the best preserved examples, contains a central tower surrounded by multiple secondary towers connected through walls and courtyards. Entire villages developed around these complexes: storage areas, living spaces, defensive structures, water systems. This wasn't isolated monument building, it was integrated settlement design, and this is where modern audiences sometimes underestimate Bronze Age societies, because we tend to associate advanced architecture with civilizations that left extensive writing behind. But writing and engineering are not the same thing. The Nuragic civilization may not have left long surviving texts, but the towers themselves demonstrate organizational complexity very clearly. There's also evidence that Sardinia participated in wider Mediterranean trade networks during this period. Artifacts found on the island suggest contact with Mycenaean Greece and other neighbouring cultures. That means the Nuragic people were not cut off from the ancient world, they were connected to it, trading, interacting, adapting. Still, the towers remain culturally distinct. Nothing in the wider Mediterranean world looks exactly like Sardinia's nuraghi. And that uniqueness is part of why the structures feel so unusual today. The environment itself also shaped the architecture. Sardinia contains rugged terrain, exposed hills, and wide interior landscapes where elevated visibility becomes strategically useful. Building stone towers in these positions creates both practical defence and symbolic dominance over the surrounding land, and many nuragi occupy exactly those kinds of locations. But even with all this information, there are still unanswered questions. Why did tower construction become so central to nuragic identity? Why maintain the tradition across so many centuries? And why did the civilization eventually decline? Like many Bronze Age cultures, the nuragic world changed gradually through outside contact, shifting political structures and broader Mediterranean instability. There was no single dramatic collapse. Instead, the towers slowly lost their original role as new powers entered the region over time. Phoenicians, Carthaginians, Romans, the island's political landscape transformed repeatedly. But the towers remained, and that endurance matters, because stone outlasts systems. Even when cultures disappear or evolve, architecture often survives longer than memory itself. Walking among the nuragi today feels strangely different from visiting classical ruins. There are no giant marble temples, no elaborate inscriptions explaining everything, just heavy stone towers standing quietly across the Sardinian landscape, some partially collapsed, others still remarkably intact, but all carrying the same basic shape repeated thousands of times across the island. That repetition creates a powerful impression, not because each tower is individually mysterious, but because together they reveal a civilization organised around a shared architectural idea strong enough to reshape an entire landscape. And maybe that's what makes Sardinia unique archaeologically. The towers are not isolated wonders. They are evidence of cultural identity expressed through construction itself, a civilization communicating through stone instead of text. The sacred cave filled with human bones, Aktun Tunishil Muknal. Aktun Tunishil Muknal is difficult to study because it remained untouched for too long. Deep inside the jungle of Belize, beyond rivers, narrow passages and flooded chambers, lies a cave system where human remains still rest almost exactly where they were left centuries ago. And that level of preservation changes everything, because sites like this don't just show what ancient people built, they show what ancient people believed strongly enough to carry into darkness underground. Aktun Tunishil Muknal, often shortened to ATM Cave, is located in western Belize within the Tapir Mountain Nature Reserve. Reaching it even today requires effort. You hike through dense forest, cross rivers, then enter a cave system where sections must be climbed, crawled, or swum through before reaching the deeper chambers. That geography matters immediately, because places this difficult to access are rarely chosen casually, especially for repeated ritual activity. The cave was used by the ancient Maya during the Classic period, particularly during times of environmental stress and drought, and that context is important. Because caves in Maya belief systems were not viewed as ordinary natural spaces, they were considered entrances to Xibalba, the underworld, a place associated with death, gods, sacrifice and transformation. So when the Maya entered caves like ATM, they were not simply exploring underground environments, they believed they were entering sacred territory. And the deeper you move into the cave, the more obvious that becomes. Artifacts begin appearing, ceramics, offerings, burn marks from ancient torches, then eventually human remains, not buried in formal tombs, not hidden, placed directly within the cave chambers themselves. This is where ATM becomes one of the most important ritual archaeology sites in the Americas. Because unlike many ancient ceremonial spaces that were looted, rebuilt, or disturbed over centuries, the deeper sections of this cave remained remarkably preserved. The humidity, mineral conditions, and isolation protected materials that would normally disappear. And that preservation allows archaeologists to study ritual activity with unusual clarity. One of the most famous discoveries inside the cave is the skeleton often called the Crystal Maiden. The name sounds dramatic, but the reality is actually more interesting than the myth around it. The bones became coated over time with mineral deposits that caused them to shimmer under light. And because the remains stayed largely undisturbed, the body position itself still provides archaeological information. Now, naturally, the first question people ask is, were these sacrifices? In many cases, the evidence suggests yes. Some remains show signs consistent with ritual killing, particularly during periods when Maya cities were experiencing drought and political instability. And this is where modern audiences sometimes misunderstand ancient ritual behaviour. Human sacrifice in Maya society was not random violence. It existed within a religious framework tied to cosmology, survival, and communication with divine forces. That does not make it less disturbing to modern people, but understanding context matters. During severe drought periods, caves likely became even more symbolically important. Water sources underground connected directly to ideas about fertility, rain, and survival. Entering caves may have been viewed as approaching supernatural forces responsible for maintaining balance in the natural world. So rituals performed in these spaces carried enormous significance. An ATM cave reinforces that idea repeatedly. The deeper chambers contain not just remains, but evidence of structured ceremonial behaviour. Artefacts were placed deliberately. Ceramic vessels were left intact or intentionally broken. Certain chambers appear to have been used more heavily than others. This wasn't chaotic activity. It followed ritual patterns. There's also the physical experience of the cave itself, and honestly, it's impossible to separate the archaeology from the environment here. Because ATM is not comfortable. The darkness is complete once natural light disappears. Passages narrow unexpectedly. Water echoes through the chambers, humidity changes the air constantly, and movement becomes slow and deliberate. That sensory environment matters. Ancient ritual spaces were often designed or selected to shape human psychology, and caves naturally do this extremely well. The deeper you move underground, the more disconnected you feel from the outside world. That separation reinforces the idea that you're entering somewhere symbolically different. Not ordinary space, sacred space. Another important detail is how carefully some objects were positioned. Archaeologists found pottery arranged in areas that would have required deliberate placement deep within the cave system. This suggests repeated visits over time, not isolated events. People returned here, again and again, and that consistency tells us the cave held stable religious significance across generations, not temporary superstition, integrated belief. One thing ATM Cave challenges directly is the simplified modern image of the Maya as either peaceful astronomers or purely violent ritualists. The reality was more complicated. The Maya were sophisticated urban societies with advanced mathematics, astronomy, architecture, agriculture, and complex religious systems involving sacrifice and ceremonial interaction with sacred landscapes. ATM preserves evidence of that complexity. There's also something emotionally different about seeing human remains in their original context, instead of displayed in museums. Inside the cave, the skeletons are still part of the environment, not separated from it, and that changes how people react to them, because the site still feels connected to its original purpose, not fully converted into ordinary archaeological display. Modern preservation rules inside ATM are extremely strict for that reason. Tourists can no longer bring cameras into certain sections after accidental damage to artifacts occurred in the past. The cave is fragile, not because it's collapsing, but because preservation depends on limiting human interference, and that's understandable. Sites this intact are extremely rare. Standing inside the deeper chambers today, the silence feels heavy, not supernatural, just isolated in a way surface environments almost never are. You become aware very quickly that ancient people intentionally entered this darkness, carrying ritual meaning with them. That decision alone tells us something powerful about belief. Because belief strong enough to bring people repeatedly into dangerous underground environments is not casual belief. Ellora Kailasa Temple, India. Most ancient monuments were built upward, stone carried piece by piece, walls rising gradually from the ground. The Kailasa Temple at Ellora works in the opposite direction. Instead of constructing a building from separate materials, its creators removed an entire mountain around it, and that changes the scale of the achievement immediately. Because this is not a structure placed onto the landscape, it is a structure carved out of the landscape itself. The Kailasa Temple is part of the Ellora Cave complex in Maharashtra, India, a site containing Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain monuments carved directly into volcanic basalt cliffs over several centuries. But even among dozens of remarkable rock-cut structures, Kailasa stands apart. Not slightly, completely. At first glance, it doesn't even look possible. You expect a temple like this to have been assembled block by block. Columns, walls, courtyards, staircases, shrines, bridges connecting different sections. Everything about the architecture suggests traditional construction, except it wasn't constructed traditionally at all. It was excavated downward from a single mass of rock. That detail is the key to understanding why the temple continues to fascinate archaeologists, architects and engineers today. Because carving a structure downward is fundamentally different from building upward. In normal construction, mistakes can often be corrected gradually. You add materials, adjust sections, replace damaged parts. But in subtractive architecture, where the mountain itself becomes the building material, errors are much harder to recover from. Once stone is removed, it cannot be put back. That means the planning had to exist before the carving began, and this is where the scale becomes difficult to fully process. Researchers estimate that hundreds of thousands of tons of rock were removed to create the temple complex, not transported in for construction, removed, cut away from the mountain itself. And unlike a cave chamber or tunnel, Kailasa contains open courtyards, freestanding towers, sculpted elephants, bridges, columns, and multiple levels of architecture, all emerging from one continuous rock mass. That requires extraordinary spatial planning. The temple is generally attributed to the Rashtrakuta king Krishna I during the 8th century CE, though construction and additions likely continued afterward. And this context matters because Kailasa was not created by a primitive or isolated society. This was a period of highly developed Indian temple architecture, advanced stoneworking traditions, and organized royal patronage. Still, even within that context, Kailasa remains exceptional. The excavation process itself appears to have started from the top of the cliff and moved downward. That's important, because it means workers first defined the outer dimensions of the structure before carving internal details. Essentially, they isolated a giant block of rock and then sculpted the temple from it step by step. This method reduced the risk of collapse compared to tunneling inward randomly. Again, that points to engineering understanding, not improvisation. And yet, people still ask the same question when they see it. How did they plan something this complex accurately? The answer is probably experience combined with highly organized labor systems. Rock-cut architecture already existed in India before Kailasa. Builders understood excavation techniques, stone behavior, and structural stability. But Kailasa expanded those principles to an unprecedented scale. This wasn't one sculptor working alone, it was a coordinated architectural project involving planners, stoneworkers, artists, labourers, and likely multiple generations of craftsmen. There's another detail worth paying attention to. The temple is not empty architecture. Its surfaces are filled with carved narrative scenes connected to Hindu mythology, especially stories involving Shiva. Massive sculptural panels line the walls. Figures emerge from pillars and corridors. Even structural components become artistic surfaces. That tells us something important. The goal was not only engineering achievement, it was symbolic transformation. The mountain itself became sacred architecture, and this is where modern comparisons to lost technology usually miss the point. Kailasa does not require impossible explanations. What it requires is accepting the scale of organized human labor and planning ancient societies were capable of under strong political and religious motivation. Because once a kingdom commits enormous resources towards sacred architecture, projects that seem impossible suddenly become achievable over long periods of time. Still, there are features that genuinely impress even modern engineers. The precision of the courtyard layout, the structural balance of elevated sections, the ability to preserve freestanding components while removing enormous surrounding masses of stone. These are not signs of supernatural construction, but they are signs of extraordinary craftsmanship. There's also the psychological effect of the site itself. Most temples create separation between structure and environment. Kailasa does something stranger. It feels simultaneously like architecture and geology, because even while you recognize columns and carvings, your brain remains aware that all of it is still connected to the mountain underneath. That creates a different emotional experience than ordinary buildings. The structure feels rooted in the earth physically, not just symbolically. The surrounding Ellora caves reinforce this feeling further. Entire halls, monasteries, shrines, and ceremonial spaces were carved into the cliffs nearby across centuries. But Kailasa became the centre of attention because it pushed the technique beyond what people expected rock-cut architecture to achieve. Not just enclosed spaces, an entire freestanding monumental complex. Over time, weathering softened parts of the carvings. empires changed. Religious power shifted across the region. But the temple itself survived because its foundation was never separate from the mountain. That permanence matters, especially in comparison to structures assembled from individual blocks that can collapse more easily over centuries. And maybe that's why colossal continues feeling so powerful today. Not because it hides some impossible secret, but because it demonstrates what becomes possible when engineering, religion, labour and artistic ambition align toward a single vision over time. The ruins covered by lava for thousands of years, Joya de Serén, El Salvador. Most archaeological sites survive because they were built from stone. Joya de Serén survived because it disappeared too quickly. Buried beneath volcanic ash in what is now El Salvador, the settlement remained sealed for centuries, protected not by walls or distance but by catastrophe itself. And because of that, archaeologists discovered something unusually rare. Not a city of kings or monuments, but an ordinary community frozen in time almost exactly as people left it. Joya de Serén dates to around the 6th century CE and belonged to the Maya cultural world of Central America. But unlike famous Maya sites dominated by pyramids, palaces, or ceremonial centres, this settlement was primarily agricultural. That distinction matters immediately, because archaeology often preserves the lives of elites more clearly than ordinary people. Royal tombs survive, temples survive, political monuments survive. Daily life usually disappears. But Joya de Serén preserved the opposite. The settlement was buried after the eruption of the nearby Loma Caldera volcano. Layers of volcanic ash rapidly covered the area, sealing structures, tools, storage spaces, and even traces of crops before long-term decay could destroy them. And this is where the site becomes historically extraordinary, because the ash acted almost like a protective blanket. It trapped the settlement in a suspended moment. People sometimes compare Joya de Serén to Pompeii, and while the comparison isn't perfect, the core idea is similar. A sudden volcanic event preserved details of everyday life that are normally lost forever. But there's one important difference. At Joya de Serén, archaeologists found strong evidence that most residents escaped before the eruption fully overwhelmed the settlement. That changes the emotional tone of the site completely. This is not primarily a story about death, it's a story about interruption. The structures uncovered at the site are relatively modest. Homes, storage buildings, work areas, communal spaces, nothing designed to impress outsiders, and that simplicity is exactly what makes the site valuable. Because ordinary architecture reveals how people actually lived. The buildings themselves were constructed using materials common in the region, wattle and daub walls supported by wooden frameworks, with thatched roofing. Normally, structures made from organic materials disappear rapidly in tropical environments. Wood decays, plant fibres collapse, mud walls erode. But the volcanic ash preserved impressions and remains in unusual detail. Archaeologists uncovered cooking vessels still positioned near hearths. Storage containers with food remains inside, agricultural tools, beans, corn, even footprints in some areas. That level of preservation creates something archaeology rarely gets: context. Not isolated artifacts removed from their environment, but objects still connected to the spaces where they were actually used, and context changes everything. A ceramic vessel displayed in a museum tells you one thing. A ceramic vessel still sitting beside a cooking area inside a preserved household tells you much more. Suddenly you can reconstruct behaviour, movement and daily routines, instead of only studying objects individually. This is why Joya de Serén became so important academically. It shifted attention toward ordinary Maya life instead of focusing only on elite ceremonial centres, because the majority of ancient people were not rulers or priests. They were farmers, craft workers, families managing food, labour and survival day by day. And sites preserving those realities are incredibly rare. There's another important detail. The settlement appears highly organised despite its relatively small scale. Structures are arranged intentionally. Work areas are separated from domestic spaces. Storage systems exist for crops and tools. This wasn't random village growth. It reflects planning shaped by community needs. And that tells us something broader about Maya civilization itself. Complex societies are not defined only by monumental cities. They depend on functioning agricultural communities capable of sustaining larger political systems. Joya de Serén preserves part of that foundation. The agricultural evidence at the site is especially significant. Researchers identified cultivated crops and farming techniques that help explain how communities in this region managed food production. There's even evidence of manioc cultivation, a crop rarely preserved archaeologically, because root plants usually leave little trace. Again, the volcanic ash preserved details that would normally vanish, and this is where volcanic destruction becomes historically ironic. The eruption erased the settlement from active life, but preserved it for future understanding. Without the ash, almost all evidence of this community would likely have disappeared naturally over time. The eruption itself was probably terrifying, but the archaeological evidence suggests people had enough warning to flee. Tools and objects were left behind quickly, but the absence of large numbers of human remains indicates evacuation rather than sudden entrapment. That distinction matters emotionally, because when you walk through reconstructed sections of the site today, the feeling is not one of mass death. It feels more like abandonment in motion, as if people expected to return once the danger passed, but never did. There's something deeply human about that realization. Cooking vessels left near fires, stored food waiting to be used, personal spaces interrupted mid-routine. The eruption didn't destroy a monument, it interrupted ordinary life, and somehow that feels more personal than many grand archaeological ruins. Joya de Seren also reminds us how fragile settlements built from organic materials really are. Entire communities can disappear from the visible landscape almost completely, unless unusual preservation conditions occur. That means archaeology is heavily biased toward what survives best. Stone dominates historical memory because stone resists time, but countless ordinary settlements likely vanished without trace. Sites like this help correct that imbalance. They remind us that ancient civilizations were not only temples and kings, they were also kitchens, fields, workshops, storage rooms. People living structured lives shaped by routine as much as ritual. The underground chambers hidden beneath the desert, Barabar Caves, India. The Barabar Caves impress people because they feel impossible the moment sound touches the walls. Deep inside the granite chambers of these caves, even a whisper changes completely. Voices echo with unnatural sharpness. Footsteps bounce across polished stone. A single sound can travel through the chamber with a clarity that feels strangely modern. And that reaction usually leads to the same question. How were spaces like this carved over 2,000 years ago with such precision? The Barabar Caves are located in the state of Bihar in eastern India, cut directly into massive granite hills during the Mauryan period around the 3rd century BCE. That timeline matters immediately, because these caves are among the oldest surviving rock-cut chambers in India. And unlike later cave temples filled with carvings and sculptures, the Barabar interiors are extremely minimal. Smooth walls, curved chambers, highly polished granite surfaces, nothing decorative distracting from the geometry itself. At first glance from outside, the caves do not look extraordinary. Simple openings cut into weathered stone hills, low entrances, heavy rock surrounding everything. But once you step inside, the atmosphere changes instantly. The surfaces are not rough like natural caves. They are polished to a near mirror-like finish in some areas, and this is where the site becomes genuinely difficult to ignore. Because granite is extremely hard stone, even today, shaping it requires effort and precision tools. Yet inside Barabar, entire chambers were carved with smooth curved walls and polished so thoroughly that light reflects off sections of the surface. This polishing style is often called the Mauryan polish, associated with the reign of Emperor Ashoka and his dynasty. And historically, that context makes sense. The Mauryan Empire represented one of the first large-scale imperial states in South Asia, capable of organising labour, transportation, and monumental construction projects on an enormous scale. Still, even with that context, the caves remain technically impressive. The interiors are carefully geometric. Long entrance halls lead toward rounded chambers with curved ceilings, designed almost mathematically in proportion. And this is where the acoustics become important, because the smooth granite surfaces reflect sound extremely efficiently. The chambers amplify echoes in ways most ancient stone structures do not. That effect was probably intentional, not accidental. Now, modern internet theories often jump immediately toward impossible explanations whenever ancient precision appears. Lost technology, unknown machines, advanced civilizations. But realistically, the evidence points towards something else. Extraordinary craftsmanship combined with time, labour, and state resources. The Mauryan Empire had access to organised labour forces and skilled stoneworkers operating under centralised authority. When those conditions exist, highly refined architecture becomes possible. Still, the precision itself deserves real respect. These were not random caves enlarged naturally over time. They were engineered spaces. Every curve affects sound. Every polished surface changes light reflection inside the chamber. And because the caves are carved directly into solid granite, mistakes would have been extremely difficult to correct. Again, this points to planning before excavation even began. The caves were also associated with the Ajivikas, an ancient ascetic religious movement that existed alongside Buddhism and Jainism during this period. And that religious context matters, because the simplicity of the chambers aligned strongly with meditative or ritual use, rather than decorative display. These were spaces meant to shape experience internally: silence, resonance, isolation. That explains why the interiors feel so controlled. The architecture itself creates psychological effects. Once inside, the outside world disappears quickly. The heavy granite absorbs visual distraction, while amplifying sound unnaturally. Even small movements become noticeable. And in ritual environments, sensory control like that can matter enormously. There's another important detail here. The caves are not located in dense urban centres. They're isolated within rocky hills. That separation was likely intentional too. Ascetic traditions in ancient India often valued withdrawal from ordinary social life. Distance from cities reinforced spiritual focus. So the caves were not only chambers, they were environments designed around separation itself. One of the most famous chambers, Lomas Rishi Cave, also contains an entrance facade carved to imitate wooden architectural forms in stone, and that detail is historically significant, because it shows a transition happening in Indian architecture. Builders were translating earlier wooden construction traditions into permanent stone design. In other words, the caves preserve architectural evolution physically. Inside, though, decoration nearly disappears again, and that restraint makes the craftsmanship feel even more striking, because there's nowhere for imperfections to hide. Smooth surfaces become the main visual feature, and smooth granite at this scale is incredibly difficult to produce consistently. Archaeologists still debate exactly how the polishing was achieved, likely through abrasion techniques using sand, stone tools, and enormous amounts of labour over time. No lost machines required, but the amount of work involved must have been extraordinary, and that's something modern audiences sometimes underestimate. Ancient states could mobilise labour at scales difficult to imagine today, especially for religious or imperial projects. The caves also influenced later Indian rock-cut architecture significantly. Many later cave temples across India expanded on ideas first visible at Barabar. Excavated interiors, controlled acoustics, carved chambers integrated directly into stone landscapes. So the site is not isolated historically. It helped establish architectural traditions that continued for centuries afterward. Still, even among later cave complexes, Barabar retains a different atmosphere. The simplicity changes how people react emotionally. There's no overload of sculpture or ornament, just geometry, polished granite, echoes, and silence between sounds. That silence matters, because the caves were likely designed not simply as shelters, but as environments for altered focus and ritual concentration. Architecture shaping mental state through sound and isolation. That's sophisticated design, not technologically impossible, but psychologically intentional. Marcahuasi, the stone formations above the clouds. Marcahuasi is different. The mystery begins with the mountain itself. High above the Peruvian landscape, on a plateau surrounded by fog, wind, and sudden silence, enormous stone formations rise from the ground in shapes that look disturbingly familiar. Faces, animals, human profiles, figures staring outward from the rock, and the longer you look at them, the harder it becomes to decide where geology ends and interpretation begins. Marcahuasi is located in the Andes of Peru, more than 4,000 metres above sea level. Reaching it even today requires a steep climb into thin mountain air, where weather changes quickly and visibility shifts constantly. That environment matters immediately, because high-altitude landscapes affect perception in very specific ways. Light changes faster, shadows sharpen, fog hides details and then suddenly reveals them again, and rock formations that seem ordinary at one angle can appear strangely deliberate from another. At first glance, Marcahuasi feels almost empty. Wide stone fields, cold wind, massive boulders scattered across the plateau. Nothing obviously architectural, no walls, no temples, no clear city ruins. But then individual formations begin standing out. And that's where the site starts affecting people psychologically. Certain rocks resemble carved faces with striking accuracy. Others appear like animals or standing human figures. Some formations seem almost symmetrical. And because human brains are naturally designed to recognize faces and patterns quickly, the plateau creates a constant sense that something intentional might exist there. This psychological effect even has a name: pareidolia, the tendency to see meaningful shapes in random forms. And Marcahuasi may be one of the strongest large-scale examples of that effect in the world. Now naturally, once people began noticing these formations, theories followed immediately. Some claim the rocks were carved by a lost civilization. Others believe the plateau contained ancient monuments eroded over time. More extreme theories connected the site to vanished races, hidden knowledge, or supernatural origins. But archaeology approaches the site much more cautiously. Because while some formations genuinely look artificial, geological erosion is capable of producing surprisingly recognizable shapes under the right conditions, especially in environments with intense wind exposure, temperature variation, and long-term weathering. That doesn't make the site less interesting. If anything, it makes it more interesting, because Marcahuasi sits right at the edge between natural geology and human interpretation, and that boundary is psychologically powerful. There's another important layer here too. The plateau was not completely untouched by ancient people. Archaeological evidence suggests pre-Columbian groups visited or used the area in some capacity. There are remains of small structures, terraces, and ceremonial activity connected to Andean cultures. That means the location itself likely carried significance long before modern tourism or internet speculation existed. And honestly, that makes sense, because dramatic landscapes often become sacred spaces naturally within human cultures, especially isolated mountain environments. In Andean traditions, mountains were frequently associated with spiritual power, ancestors, and divine presence. So even if the stone formations themselves are natural, the plateau may still have held ritual or ceremonial importance. And those two things are not contradictory. Ancient cultures often treated unusual natural formations as sacred precisely because they appeared extraordinary. The altitude itself also changes how people experience the site physically. At over 4,000 meters, oxygen levels are lower. Fatigue builds faster. Perception can become slightly altered through exhaustion, cold, and isolation. And when you combine that with shifting fog and massive human-like stone shapes, the environment starts feeling psychologically intense very quickly. That's important context, because experiences in extreme landscapes are never purely visual. The environment affects the body too. Some formations at Marcahuasi have become famous individually. One of the best known is the so-called Monument to Humanity, a rock face where different human profiles seem to emerge depending on lighting conditions and viewing angles. That detail is crucial, because perspective changes everything at Marcahuasi. A formation that looks random from one direction can suddenly appear almost sculpted from another. And once your brain recognizes a face, it becomes difficult to unsee it. This is why debates around the site never fully disappear. The formations are convincing enough to trigger interpretation, but inconsistent enough to resist definitive explanation. There's no clear evidence of large-scale carving tools or systematic sculptural work across the plateau, but there are enough uncanny shapes to keep people questioning what they're seeing. And honestly, that uncertainty may be the most important part of Marcahuasi, because the site reveals something about human perception itself. We are pattern-seeking creatures, especially in environments that already feel emotionally charged. The brain constantly tries to transform randomness into meaning. At Marcahuasi, the landscape gives it endless opportunities to do exactly that. There's also a reason photographs rarely capture the full atmosphere of the plateau accurately. Marcahuasi changes constantly depending on weather and light. Fog rolls in suddenly. Shadows stretch across formations differently hour by hour. At sunrise or sunset, some rocks appear dramatically more human-like than they do at midday. So the experience becomes dynamic instead of fixed. That instability probably contributed to the myth surrounding the site over time, because places that never look exactly the same twice naturally encourage storytelling, especially in isolated mountain regions where oral tradition historically shaped local identity. Still, separating mythology from archaeology matters. There's no strong scientific evidence that the plateau contains a giant forgotten stone civilization. Most formations appear consistent with natural erosion patterns shaped over extremely long periods. But the absence of artificial origins does not remove the emotional effect of the landscape itself. And that emotional effect is real. Standing on the plateau today, especially in silence, you begin understanding why people reacted so strongly to it. The scale, the isolation, the strange familiarity of the stone shapes, everything combines into a landscape that feels unusually alive despite being entirely geological. And maybe that's why Marcahuasi continues attracting attention, generation after generation. Not because it proves ancient mysteries, but because it reveals how easily the human mind begins searching for meaning in stone once environment, scale, and imagination start working together. The forgotten structures around Ingapirka. Most people remember Ingapirka for one thing: the great elliptical temple rising above the Ecuadorian highlands, the carefully fitted stone walls, the unmistakable precision associated with Inca engineering. But the main temple was never the entire site. Scattered around the complex are smaller structures that most visitors barely notice. Low foundations, partial walls, enclosed spaces, and pathways that seem insignificant compared to the monument at the centre. And yet, those quieter structures may actually reveal more about how the settlement truly functioned. Because monuments show power, ordinary structures show life. Ingapirka is located in the southern Andes of Ecuador, at high elevation where cold air, shifting fog and open grassland shape the landscape constantly. The site is best known as the largest surviving Inca archaeological complex in Ecuador, although its history is more complicated than that description suggests. Before the Inca arrived, the region was already occupied by the Cañari people, who had their own traditions, ceremonial systems and architectural practices. That detail matters immediately, because Ingapirka was not built by a single culture in isolation. It became a layered site where different societies left visible traces over time. The large Temple of the Sun usually receives most of the attention, and understandably so. Its curved walls and precisely fitted stones stand out instantly. But once you move away from the monumental centre, the site changes character. The smaller surrounding structures feel quieter, less symbolic, more practical, and that's exactly why they matter archaeologically. These secondary structures include rectangular foundations, enclosed rooms, storage areas, stairways, terraces, and open courtyards spread across the complex. At first glance they appear simple, but simplicity in archaeology is often deceptive. Because large ceremonial centres cannot function through monuments alone. They require infrastructure, food storage, living areas, administrative organisation, movement systems connecting one part of the site to another, and the lesser structures at Ingapirka preserve evidence of exactly that. One of the most important details archaeologists noticed is the contrast in construction styles. Some walls reflect classic Inca masonry, carefully shaped stones fitted tightly together without mortar. Others appear rougher and more irregular, consistent with earlier Cañari techniques. That difference matters historically, because it suggests the site evolved through occupation and adaptation, rather than appearing fully formed all at once. The Inca did not arrive on empty land. They incorporated an existing sacred and political landscape into their own system. And this is where Ingapirka becomes more interesting than people often realise. It's not simply an Inca ruin. It's evidence of cultural interaction, possibly cooperation in some periods, possibly domination in others. Architecture preserves traces of those relationships physically. The smaller structures also reveal something important about Inca administration. The empire depended heavily on logistics, road systems, storage facilities, regional organisation. Ceremonial centres were connected to broader networks of labour and communication across the Andes. And sites like Ingapirka functioned as nodes within that system. Some of the lesser buildings were likely used as living quarters for priests, officials or attendants connected to the ceremonial complex. Others may have stored agricultural goods or ritual supplies. There's evidence of controlled spaces designed for gathering, movement and management rather than monumental display. And that distinction matters, because it reminds us that ancient ceremonial centres were active environments, not isolated monuments existing separately from daily life. The terraces surrounding parts of the site also deserve attention. In mountain environments, terraces serve multiple functions. agriculture, drainage control, slope stabilization, and sometimes ceremonial organization. At Ingapirka, the terraces help integrate the structures directly into the landscape, rather than forcing the landscape to conform completely to architecture. That approach is very characteristic of Andean engineering traditions. Another important detail is orientation. Like many Inca sites, parts of Ingapirka appear aligned with solar observation and seasonal cycles. The Temple of the Sun reflects this most clearly, but surrounding structures likely supported ceremonial activities connected to those alignments. Again, this shows planning beyond isolated buildings. The site functioned as an organized spatial system. The location itself also played a role politically. The Inca Empire expanded into Ecuador relatively late compared to other regions of the Andes, and controlling distant territories required more than military force alone. Ceremonial architecture became a way of establishing imperial presence physically across conquered landscapes. Building or modifying sacred sites reinforced political authority symbolically, and Ingapirka reflects that process clearly. Still, the smaller structures retain a different atmosphere from the main temple. They feel less theatrical, more human. You can imagine movement there more easily. Storage activities, preparation, people walking between rooms carrying goods or performing tasks connected to the larger ceremonial centre. And honestly, those ordinary functions are often what make archaeological sites feel real, because civilizations are not sustained by monuments alone. They are sustained by systems operating quietly around them. There's also evidence that some areas of the site were rebuilt or modified over time, walls repaired, spaces redefined, architectural styles overlapping. That gradual change reminds us something important. Ancient sites were not frozen in perfect original form while people lived there. They evolve continuously, just like modern cities do. When the Spanish conquest reshaped the Andes in the 16th century, many ceremonial systems connected to places like Ingapirka were disrupted permanently. The site declined. Stone was reused elsewhere. Structures deteriorated, and over centuries the more dramatic parts of the complex naturally attracted the most attention from outsiders. But the lesser structures remained essential for understanding the site as a functioning settlement instead of just a monument, because archaeology becomes distorted when we only focus on spectacular buildings. The quieter structures often explain how the larger ones actually operated. And at Ingapirka, those quieter spaces still preserve traces of organisation, adaptation, and daily activity beneath the shadow of the main temple. Kokino, the stone observatory above the Balkans. Others to bury the dead. Kokino appears to have been built for something less physical and far more difficult to see: time. High above the mountains of North Macedonia, carved into volcanic stone exposed to wind and sky, the site contains carefully positioned markers aligned with the movement of the sun and moon. And once those alignments were studied seriously, archaeologists realized they were looking at something unusual. Not just a settlement, but a place designed to observe the heavens directly from the mountain itself. Kokino is located near the Serbian border in a rugged volcanic landscape, where jagged rock formations rise naturally above the surrounding terrain. At first glance, the site doesn't resemble the kind of observatory modern people imagine. There are no domes, no instruments, no towering structures pointing toward the sky. Just exposed stone surfaces shaped by both geology and human modification. And that simplicity is exactly what makes the site so important. Because ancient astronomy rarely depended on devices, it depended on observation. The site dates back to the Bronze Age, roughly around 1800 BCE, although activity in the region may extend earlier. That places Kokino within a period when human societies across different parts of the world were becoming increasingly aware of celestial cycles and seasonal timing, and that awareness mattered far beyond curiosity. In agricultural societies, understanding the movement of the sun directly affected survival. Planting seasons, harvest cycles, religious ceremonies, migration patterns, time itself became connected to the sky. What makes Kokino stand out archaeologically is the arrangement of carved stone markers positioned along elevated viewpoints. Researchers identified specific notches and seats carved into the volcanic rock that align with solar events such as sunrise during the summer and winter solstices. Some alignments may also relate to lunar cycles, and this is where the site changes from interesting geology into intentional design. Because celestial alignment at this level requires repeated long-term observation. You don't accidentally place markers where the sun rises during exact seasonal moments. You track those movements carefully over years, possibly generations. That immediately tells us something important about the people who use Kokino. They were not simply surviving day by day without awareness of larger natural systems. They were studying patterns, recognizing cycles, connecting landscape with astronomy. There's another detail that matters here. Kokino is elevated, very elevated, and elevation changes visibility dramatically. From the mountain ridge, the horizon opens in multiple directions, creating clear sight lines towards sunrise and sunset points throughout the year. That makes the location practical for observation. But it also creates symbolic separation from ordinary daily space below. Ancient observatories were often ceremonial spaces too. The act of watching the sky became ritualized, and Kokino likely functioned the same way. Some carved stone seats found at the site are especially interesting. One prominent seat-like formation overlooks the aligned markers directly. Archaeologists sometimes refer to it informally as a throne, though the exact purpose remains uncertain. Still, its placement suggests controlled viewing. Someone important may have occupied that position during observations or ceremonies connected to celestial events. Again, architecture shaping experience. Now naturally, once a site becomes associated with astronomy, exaggerated claims often follow. Ancient advanced civilizations, hidden knowledge, impossible precision. But Kokino doesn't need those ideas to remain impressive, because what the evidence already shows is enough. Bronze Age communities developed sophisticated observational relationships with the sky, using landscape and stone instead of modern instruments. That's real, and historically significant. The volcanic rock itself also contributes heavily to the atmosphere of the site. The terrain feels raw and exposed. Sharp formations rise unpredictably from the ridge, and because the structures blend directly into natural geology, it can sometimes be difficult to separate human modification from the mountain itself. That blending may have been intentional. Ancient sacred sites often worked with existing landscapes rather than replacing them completely. There's also something psychologically important about sky observation in isolated mountain environments. Without modern light pollution, ancient skies would have appeared overwhelming in clarity. Stars, planetary movement, seasonal changes in sunrise positions, all of it far more visible than what most modern people experience today. So sites like Kokino were not disconnected from ordinary life. They were practical interfaces between environment, survival, and belief. And this is where astronomy becomes cultural rather than purely scientific. The people using Kokino were not astronomers in the modern sense. They weren't calculating astrophysics. They were observing recurring celestial behavior and integrating it into systems of ritual, agriculture, and social timing. That distinction matters, because ancient astronomy was deeply tied to meaning. The mountain location likely reinforced that meaning further. High places across many ancient cultures became associated with closeness to divine or cosmic forces. The sky feels physically nearer on elevated terrain, and when major solar events occur visibly across carefully aligned markers, the experience becomes emotionally powerful even now. There's another reason Kokino became internationally recognized. Modern archaeoastronomers studying the alignments concluded that the site represented one of the oldest known astronomical observation locations in Europe. That recognition helped shift public attention toward the Balkans' prehistoric history, something often overshadowed by more famous Mediterranean civilizations nearby. And that matters historically, because sophisticated observational cultures existed far beyond the major empires usually dominating ancient history discussions. When standing at Kokino today, the feeling is very different from visiting enclosed ruins or underground chambers. Everything is open, wind moving constantly across exposed stone, the horizon stretching outward in silence, the sky dominating the environment completely, and suddenly the purpose of the site starts making sense emotionally, not just academically. Because the mountain itself becomes part of the observation system. The stone markers don't force attention upward artificially. The entire landscape already does that naturally. The alignments simply organize what people were already watching. And maybe that's the most important thing Kokino reveals. Ancient astronomical knowledge did not always require massive monuments or advanced tools. Sometimes it required patience, generational observation, and a landscape positioned perfectly between earth and sky. The ancient ruins, covered by an entire forest, Beng Mealea, Cambodia, Some ancient ruins survive because people protected them. Beng Mealea survived because nature swallowed it, slowly enough not to destroy it completely. Deep within the Cambodian forest, massive stone galleries lie broken beneath giant tree roots. Walls collapse into vegetation. Corridors disappear into shadow. Entire sections of architecture seem trapped halfway between ruin and jungle. And unlike heavily restored temple complexes nearby, Beng Mealea still feels unfinished by time itself. Not reconstructed, not controlled, just overtaken. Located roughly 40 kilometers east of Angkor Wat, Beng Mealea was built during the Khmer Empire, likely in the 12th century during the reign of King Suryavarman II, the same ruler associated with Angkor Wat itself. That historical connection matters immediately, because Beng Mealea was not an isolated jungle temple built by a forgotten tribe. It emerged from one of the most powerful and architecturally advanced civilizations in Southeast Asia. And yet today, it feels far more abandoned than the famous monuments surrounding Angkor. At first glance, the temple almost disappears into the forest. Large sandstone blocks lie scattered across the ground, as though the structure collapsed naturally under its own weight. Trees grow directly through walls. Roots wrap around corridors. Sections of ceiling have fallen inward, allowing sunlight to pour into spaces that were once enclosed. And this blending between architecture and vegetation changes how the site feels emotionally. Because Beng Mealea no longer appears separate from the environment, the jungle became part of the structure. Architecturally, the temple follows many classic Khmer design principles: long galleries, central sanctuaries, courtyards, raised causeways, complex enclosure walls. But unlike Angkor Wat, much of Beng Mealea remains unrestored, and that lack of reconstruction reveals something important: how vulnerable even monumental architecture becomes once maintenance stops. The Khmer Empire depended heavily on continuous labour systems. Roads needed clearing, water systems required management, stone structures demanded repair over time. When political power weakened and major urban centres declined, nature moved in quickly, especially in tropical climates, and tropical environments are relentless. Moisture weakens stone joints, roots expand through cracks, vegetation traps water against surfaces. Small structural failures gradually become collapses. At Beng Mealea, you can see this process physically everywhere. The ruin itself became an ecological system. But here's the fascinating part. The forest also protected the temple in certain ways. Dense vegetation isolated the site from large-scale human interference for long periods. While some looting occurred historically, sections of the structure remained hidden enough to preserve much of the original atmosphere. And that atmosphere feels completely different from restored archaeological parks, because Beng Mealea still carries the unpredictability of abandonment. Walking through the site today feels less like visiting a monument, and more like entering a place still being reclaimed. Pathways shift. Stone blocks sit at strange angles. Trees emerge from collapsed chambers, and sometimes it becomes difficult to tell whether the architecture supports the forest, or the forest supports the architecture. This is one reason Beng Mealea became so visually famous. The contrast between massive Khmer engineering and uncontrolled jungle growth creates powerful imagery immediately. But beyond appearance, the site also reveals something deeper about ancient infrastructure. Because temples like this were never meant to stand alone. They existed within networks of roads, settlements, water systems, and administrative controls spread across the Khmer Empire. When those systems weakened, even major stone complexes became fragile over time. The temple itself was likely dedicated to Hindu worship originally, although later Buddhist influence may also have shaped parts of the site, as happened at many Khmer monuments during periods of religious transition. That layered religious history matters because Southeast Asian sacred architecture often evolved rather than remaining fixed permanently under one belief system. Structures adapted across generations, meaning changed while architecture remained. There's another important detail at Beng Mealea. Unlike some ceremonial structures designed mainly for symbolism, this temple feels spatially immersive. The galleries are extensive, the corridors long and interconnected. Movement through the complex becomes physical and disorienting in certain sections, and once collapse and vegetation alter those pathways, the effect intensifies. You no longer experience the temple exactly as its builders intended. You experience it through layers of destruction and natural transformation added afterward. That creates a strange feeling unique to ruins overtaken by forest. The architecture still communicates intentional order, but the jungle interrupts it constantly. Straight corridors end in fallen stone. Doorways open into tangled roots. Light enters where ceilings collapsed centuries ago, and because of that, the site feels alive in a way restored monuments sometimes do not. The sandstone used in Khmer construction also contributes to the atmosphere. Over time, moisture and biological growth softened surfaces and darkened sections of the stone. Details eroded unevenly, carvings faded in places while surviving sharply in others. The forest did not erase the temple evenly, it transformed it selectively. And maybe that's why Beng Mealea affects people differently than more polished archaeological sites. It still feels unstable, not dangerous exactly, but unresolved, as if the process of becoming a ruin is still happening. There's also something historically important about that feeling, because ancient cities and temples rarely vanished instantly. Decline was gradual, maintenance stopped, communities shifted elsewhere. Nature entered abandoned spaces little by little, until architecture and environment became inseparable. Beng Mealea preserves that transition visibly. It reminds us that ruins are not static objects. They are ongoing processes shaped by weather, vegetation, geology, and time long after human occupation ends. Standing inside the complex today, the soundscape becomes part of the experience. Wind moving through broken galleries, insects inside collapsed chambers, roots pressing silently against stone, and beneath all of it, the underlying geometry of Khmer architecture still holding together despite centuries of pressure from the forest around it. That endurance matters, because even after collapse, enough structure remains to reveal the original scale and sophistication of the design. The empire faded, the jungle advanced, but the core architecture refused to disappear completely.